The grand halls of Elliott Palace sparkled with the characteristic brilliance of English nobility. Ornate chandeliers hung like jewels above crowned heads and aristocratic attire, as the sound of refined conversations and subdued laughter softly echoed. Yet amidst the grandeur, Charles Elliott, the influential Duke of Silvermere, remained indifferent. The luxury that enchanted so many merely underscored his boredom. Power and prestige, achieved in his youth, had made him a man accustomed to victory. But the challenge that once motivated him now seemed distant, until the arrival of Lord Victor Cavendish. "Your Grace," Victor began with a cynical smile that deeply irritated Charles. "I heard you are always seeking new entertainments. I have a proposal that might satisfy your inclination for challenges." The room seemed to freeze around them, even though the conversation remained subdued. Charles raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but maintained the serene demeanor that was characteristic of him. "And what do you believe you could offer me, Victor?" "I'm familiar with your provocations, and they seldom warrant my attention." Victor leaned slightly forward, as if confiding something forbidden. "I bet the Duke of Silvermere, with his impeccable reputation, wouldn't dare marry someone who doesn't fit the rigid standards of our aristocracy. A woman outside the mold, shall we say?" Charles allowed himself a barely perceptible smile. "And why would I give attention to such absurdity?" he asked unhurriedly. Victor smiled triumphantly. "Because your Grace would never refuse a true challenge. The lady in question is Eloise Hale. She is not a countess, nor even the daughter of a respectable house, merely a woman with an indomitable spirit and sharp intellect, but of course completely alien to the conventions we so highly value." The name was not unfamiliar to Charles. Eloise Hale, the daughter of a failed merchant, had become famous not for her lineage, but for her wit and candor. To some, a daring revolutionary. To others, an indecipherable enigma. "What do you propose?" Charles asked, his voice as controlled as his expression. "Marry her and maintain the marriage for 6 months," Victor responded with a challenging tone. "If you succeed, I will cede my lands in Devonshire to the Duchy of Silvermere. Otherwise, half of your fortune will be donated to charitable causes. What do you say, Charles?" The ballroom, until then alive with the symphony of aristocratic conversations, seemed strangely muted. Charles pondered for a moment, evaluating the proposal. Then, with a calculated look, he extended his hand. 6 months, Victor? Consider it a deal." As Eloise left with the steady elegance of someone who commanded her own destiny, Charles noticed something unsettling. For the first time in a long while, he felt out of control. The game had begun, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. The announcement of the engagement between Charles Elliott, Duke of Silvermere, and Eloise Hale spread like wildfire through the halls of London high society. What was seen as an affront to tradition immediately became the main topic of conversation. The most sought-after man in the aristocracy, known for his sophistication and exclusive circle of friends, had chosen to marry a woman without title, fortune, and, worse yet for many, without the slightest intention of pleasing anyone. "She is unbearably frank," the matrons whispered indignantly, "and she seems to have no interest in fitting in." For Eloise, however, the murmurs were insignificant, a background noise incapable of diverting her attention. In Charles's luxuriously decorated office, Eloise sat in a leather armchair, her fingers clasped in her lap, gazing at her future husband with the calmness of a strategist preparing for battle. The fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows around the room, but it did little to soften the confrontational air between the two. "If we are to proceed with this union," Eloise began, her voice firm and direct, "we must establish clear rules." Charles, leaning back elegantly in the opposite armchair, raised an eyebrow, more intrigued than offended. "Rules, Miss Hale? It sounds more like a business contract than a marriage." Eloise gave a short smile, devoid of humor. "Convenient, considering that's exactly how you approached me." She adjusted herself in the armchair as though mentally preparing a list. "First rule, keep your money away from me. I don't want luxurious dresses, extravagant jewels, or mansions decorated with questionable taste. And please, no carriages that announce your fortune on every street corner. Charles leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Do flowers fall into that category of frivolities? Flowers are acceptable, Eloise responded coolly, but no sentimental notes or rehearsed verses. For the first time, Charles let out a genuine laugh. There was something irresistibly captivating about Eloise's cutting clarity. Fair enough, no ostentation. And what is the second rule? Eloise leaned back again, crossing her arms. Freedom. I will not abandon my routine, my friends, or the places I frequent. I won't make this marriage a prison, even a gilded one. Charles nodded, keeping a smile on his lips. Fair. And the third rule? This time, Eloise hesitated. Her eyes locked onto his with intensity. No pretenses. Don't fake noble feelings, Duke. There's no need for forced romance. We are entering an agreement, not a sentimental farce. That must be clear from the beginning. Charles raised an eyebrow. You're always this direct, Miss Hale? Eloise let out a dry laugh. I prefer to be practical. Something, I suppose, you wouldn't understand. Despite the provocation, Charles laughed again. Her frankness was refreshing, but also disarming. She spoke with the confidence of someone in control, something the Duke rarely encountered in others. The days leading up to the wedding brought new levels of intrigue for Charles. Eloise was unlike any woman he had ever known, and that both unsettled and fascinated him. He tried observing her from afar, following her on walks in the park and to discreet events. Her way of interacting with others was devoid of pretense. She seemed oblivious to the masks that society insisted on wearing. On one of these walks, Charles broke the silence. You don't seem anxious about the wedding. Shouldn't you be picking out lace and veils? Eloise turned to him, her eyes carrying a glint of irony. Perhaps I care less about lace than you imagine, Your Grace. My concern is different. What will you do when you realize your wager is more complicated than you expected? Charles laughed, but there was a sincerity in her tone that unsettled him. And what exactly should I fear, Miss Hale? Eloise gave a cryptic smile. That, in the end, the control of this game may not be entirely in your hands. On the morning of the wedding, Charles observed his own reflection in the mirror longer than usual. He was impeccable, as always, but there was something different in his expression. A mix of anticipation and uncertainty, emotions that rarely visited him. Eloise, with her unpredictability, seemed like an enigma he didn't know how to decipher. When she entered the ceremony hall, the atmosphere seemed to pause for a moment. The dress she wore was simple, without the lavish adornments the occasion might suggest, but her posture radiated confidence. It wasn't her beauty that captivated, but the way she carried herself, like someone who had already faced and conquered far greater internal battles than the judgment of strangers. The vows were exchanged with formality, almost without emotion, but laden with a veiled tension that only they understood. When Charles helped Eloise into the carriage that would take them to his estate, he couldn't resist a comment. 6 months, Miss Hale. It seems like little time, but something tells me these will be the longest months of my life. Eloise cast him a brief glance before responding, with a subtle and sharp smile. I hope you're prepared, Duke. I certainly am. The first days of marriage between Charles Elliot, Duke of Silvermere, and Eloise Hale were filled with tense silence. The Duke's mansion, located in Mayfair, was a monument to wealth and prestige, with sumptuous halls, endless corridors, and well-tended gardens, but devoid of any human warmth. Eloise walked through the spaces like a visitor, studying every detail but showing no intimidation. Charles, for his part, watched her from a distance. She seemed to adapt effortlessly, or perhaps hid any discomfort with great skill. This attitude intrigued him, as most people quickly yielded to the weight of his presence and the grandeur surrounding him. On the third day, Charles found Eloise in the main hall. He was reading the newspaper, but looked up as soon as she entered. Would you like to see the rest of the house? He asked, a contained smile on his lips. Eloise raised an eyebrow skeptically. Why not? It's always good to know where the exits are, Her response elicited a genuine laugh from Charles. "Always ready to escape, Eloise?" She shrugged with indifference. One can never be too cautious. As they walked through the mansion's corridors, Charles noticed that Eloise's questions didn't focus on the opulence as he had expected. She didn't comment on the Italian marble, the rare tapestries, or the ornate ceilings. Instead, her attention fell on the paintings on the walls, the gardens that seemed neglected, and even the servants working quietly. "You seem more interested in the stories of others than in your new home," Charles observed, intrigued. Eloise replied without hesitation, her voice firm. "Because details matter more than appearances." That evening, dinner followed the usual pattern, an uncomfortable silence filled with polite conversations and generalities. However, Charles decided to break the seemingly insurmountable barrier. "Eloise," he began, twirling his wine glass between his fingers, "how has the experience of becoming Mrs. Elliot been?" Eloise carefully placed her glass down, her movements calculated. "Ah, delightful," she replied, the sarcasm evident in her tone. "Especially considering it's like living in a display case. Everyone watches, waiting for me to stumble." Her words caught him off guard. For the first time, Charles felt a genuine discomfort as he realized the weight this marriage had placed on Eloise, or the strength she needed to demonstrate to face it. The days turned into weeks, and Eloise began establishing her own routines. She strolled through bookstores, spent long hours in public gardens, and, to Charles's astonishment, became involved in charitable causes. Her dedication to helping needy families seemed to contradict the lifestyle he had imagined she would adopt as a duchess. "You don't need to involve yourself so much," Charles commented one day, seeing her organize baskets of food for a charity event. Eloise paused what she was doing and looked at him firmly. "And why not? Because it's not what's expected of a woman in my position, or because it threatens the image you want to maintain?" Charles was left speechless, something rare for him. There was something unsettling about Eloise's ability to expose truths with surgical precision. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for her determination. Despite her unshakable demeanor, Eloise also faced her own demons. During lonely nights, while Charles fulfilled his social obligations, she allowed herself to reflect. The death of her father, caused in part by financial decisions influenced by Charles himself, was still an open wound. For Eloise, the marriage was more than a wager or an agreement. It was a way to balance the scales. But the more time passed, the more she questioned whether she was ready for the consequences of her actions. One evening, Charles returned early from an engagement and found Eloise in the office. She was reading a book by the fireplace, the flickering light enhancing her calm expression. He hesitated before entering. "Do you feel comfortable here, Eloise?" he asked in a tone more vulnerable than he intended. Eloise carefully closed the book and stood. "Comfortable? Number. But that was never part of the agreement, was it?" Charles smiled, but something in his gaze had changed. "Perhaps not. But I think we both deserve a bit of peace." Gradually, their interactions began to change. Small gestures started to fill the silences. Charles bringing tea to Eloise during her readings, Eloise commenting on the progress in the garden, which he had neglected for years. There was still tension between them, but also a mutual curiosity. When Charles suggested a walk in the park, Eloise agreed. As they strolled side by side, she teased him. "You always like to make things seem natural, don't you?" Charles chuckled softly. "And you always like to point out what's wrong." She stopped, turning to him with an intensity that made him hesitate. "Someone has to. You live in a world where no one dares to." Charles remained silent, admiring the fire in her eyes. Finally, he murmured, "Maybe that's why I can't ignore you." Eloise felt her heart quicken, but maintained her composure. They continued walking, both aware that something was changing, though neither was ready to admit it. The days at Silvermere Mansion had become a field of subtle emotional battles. The marriage, which initially seemed a matter of convenience and challenge, began to reveal deeper layers of who Charles and Eloise truly were. The forced coexistence acted like a mirror, reflecting vulnerabilities that both preferred to hide, even from themselves. On a cold morning, Eloise, wrapped in a simple shawl, decided to explore the estate's gardens. The vastness of the place was oppressive, but she walked with determination. She arrived at the stables where she found Charles, something she never expected. He was brushing one of his horses, his movements precise and skilled. "I didn't know Mr. Elliot engaged in such manual tasks," Eloise said, her voice laced with a touch of sarcasm. Charles smirked slightly, not taking his eyes off the animal. "And you, Eloise? I thought you'd prefer to ignore the details of such an opulent estate." She crossed her arms, lifting her chin slightly. "Ignoring details has never been my specialty, Charles. Perhaps that's why we're so different." He turned to look at her directly, his eyes fixed on hers as if trying to decipher her. "Perhaps," he replied calmly, before returning to his work. To Charles, every conversation with Eloise was a mystery. She didn't follow the rules of the nobility, nor did she bother to conform to expectations. That's what intrigued him and disarmed him. That same evening, during dinner, Eloise decided to abandon the usual courtesies. "Charles, why did you agree to marry me?" The question, posed calmly, was a direct blow. Charles paused, his fork hovering over the plate. He looked at her, his expression betraying a moment of hesitation. "I like challenges," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "And you, Eloise, are the greatest of them." Eloise laughed, but the sound was dry, devoid of humor. "Is that what I am to you? A challenge? A trophy to add to your collection?" She shook her head, disappointed. "I hope you realize that some things cannot be won with cleverness or fortune, Charles." For a moment, he opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. There was no argument that could invalidate what she had said. After that conversation, a quiet shift took place. Eloise, always steadfast, began to avoid deeper discussions, keeping their interactions practical and functional. Charles, on the other hand, started observing her more closely. He noticed how she moved through the mansion, treating the staff as equals, or how she would rearrange the library with a focus that seemed almost meditative. Eloise didn't just exist in that space. She transformed it, albeit subtly. It was impossible for Charles not to wonder, who was this woman who rejected his wealth, challenged his logic, and yet managed to command every room she entered? Behind her mask of self-sufficiency, Eloise was also grappling with her own conflicts. On lonely nights, with moonlight spilling into her room, she found herself thinking about Charles, not the man who had made the wager, but the man who showed an almost imperceptible kindness when he thought no one was watching. These moments made her question her own motives. Was she allowing herself to believe there was more to Charles than arrogance and power? And if that were true, what would it mean for her original purpose of settling the debts of the past? The marriage between Charles and Eloise was far from conventional. As months passed, the initial barrier of distrust had given way to a more harmonious coexistence. Yet there was still something unexplored between them, a tension that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Beneath the surface of mutual respect and curiosity, dangerous secrets threatened to shatter the fragile balance. Their routine was interrupted by an unexpected visit on a cloudy afternoon. Lord Victor Cavendish, the man who had orchestrated the wager that brought Charles and Eloise together, arrived at the mansion with a provocative smile. Eloise greeted him in the drawing room with the same poise she reserved for her husband. "I see you're making the most of your new position, Mrs. Elliot," Victor remarked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "And I see you're as smug as ever, Lord Cavendish," Eloise retorted, her voice icy. Before the exchange could escalate, Charles entered the room. He immediately sensed the tension in the air and frowned. "Victor, I assume you have a good reason for showing up unannounced." Victor smiled, ignoring his host's coldness. "I was merely complimenting your wife. A fascinating choice, I must say." There was something in Victor's tone that unsettled Charles, but Eloise remained impassive. "Indeed, Lord Cavendish. We owe you our thanks. After all, without you, we wouldn't be here." Victor departed shortly after, but the discomfort lingered. Once they were alone, Charles confronted Eloise. "What was that exchange of glances about?" he demanded, trying to read her. Eloise tilted her head slightly, her gaze defiant. "You seem suspicious, Charles. Don't you think I have every reason to act as I please, given the circumstances?" He tried to press further, but Eloise left the drawing room, ending the conversation before it could even begin. The days that followed brought a subtle but noticeable change in Eloise's demeanor. She seemed distant, as though carrying a burden she couldn't share. Charles, on the other hand, began paying closer attention to every gesture, every word. "You can't just ignore something that's eating me alive," he said one evening, finding her near the fireplace. Eloise met his gaze, her eyes shining with an intensity that unsettled him. "And what would you do, Charles, if you knew the problem was me? That perhaps what I'm hiding could change everything?" Charles was silent. For the first time, he felt the weight of not knowing how to respond. The following night, Eloise could no longer hold back. "I need to tell you something," she began hesitantly. Charles, seated in his study with a book in hand, closed it and gave her his full attention. "You know my father lost everything, don't you? That he died with nothing." Charles nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with caution. "I've heard rumors, but what does that have to do with—" Eloise cut him off, her voice now firm and laden with emotion. "It was because of you, Charles. He trusted one of your companies. When you bought out the competition, my father was dragged down with it. He lost everything, even his will to live." The revelation hit like a blow. Charles felt as though the air had been ripped from his lungs. "Eloise, I didn't know. I never knew this happened." "Of course you didn't," she replied, her voice filled with restrained pain. "Men like you don't look at the people crushed in your rise to power. But I remember it all. Every moment, every tear. And that's why I agreed to this marriage. To ensure you'd never forget." Charles remained silent, unable to find the words. Eloise watched him, vulnerable in a way she hated to admit. "Now you know, Charles. Now you understand why I could never trust you." The following days were marked by silence and introspection. Charles locked himself in his office, revisiting old contracts, trying to find records that could confirm or deny Eloise's story. He needed to know if there was any way to repair the damage, or if it was too late for redemption. Eloise, for her part, kept herself busy, but the weight of her confession lingered. She knew revealing the truth was necessary, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. On a quiet evening, Charles finally sought her out. He was different, more vulnerable, more human. "Eloise," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I know I can't change what happened, but I want to try. Not out of obligation, but because you deserve something better. Something I may never have given anyone before. Sincerity." Eloise looked at him, surprised by the honesty she rarely saw in him. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. There was still hurt, but also something unexpected, a spark of hope. The path between them was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, Eloise allowed herself to think that there might be a chance for something different. Not to forget the past, but to find a new future. Charles's confession marked the beginning of a transformation neither he nor Eloise could have predicted. As the words sincerity and change resonated between them, both knew the real challenge would be proving that these promises could withstand the weight of the past and the mistrust. Eloise, pragmatic and realistic, did not expect miracles. Charles, however, seemed determined to achieve the impossible to win something he couldn't yet name. In the following days, Charles showed that his words were more than an attempt to appease Eloise. He began attending meetings with local merchants, something he had never done before. It was a small gesture, but Eloise watched carefully. "I want to understand the impact of my actions," he said one evening during a quiet dinner. "I want to know how to fix things, not just with you, but with everyone I've wronged." Eloise set her fork down on the plate, studying him intently. "We'll see if your intentions are more than empty gestures," she replied, her voice firm but without sarcasm. One of the most significant moments came during a visit to a widow who had lost her family business due to a merger orchestrated by Charles years earlier. Eloise insisted on accompanying him, staying in the background, but observing every word closely. "Mrs. Cartwright," Charles began, his voice softer than usual, "I came to apologize. What happened was a consequence of my decisions, and I deeply regret it." The sincerity in his words was evident, and the shock on the woman's face showed she hadn't expected to hear them. Charles offered financial support to help her rebuild her business, but it was his act of looking her in the eyes, facing the pain he had caused, that impressed Eloise. Back at the mansion, Charles seemed exhausted. "I didn't realize it was so hard to face the past," he confessed to Eloise, who observed him from across the room. "Maybe you're starting to understand that power isn't just control," she replied calmly. "It's responsibility." Over time, the atmosphere between them began to change. Dinner conversations shifted from brief exchanges to stories about their childhoods. Charles shared memories of his father, a strict man who treated affection as a weakness. Eloise spoke about the happy days before her father lost everything, moments she treasured despite the pain. These exchanges didn't solve their problems but built bridges. Eloise, however, remained cautious. She knew forgiveness wasn't something easily granted, especially considering what was at stake. One night, while Eloise was reading in the library, Charles entered. He seemed hesitant but determined. "Eloise," he began, sitting close to her, "I need to ask you something. Do you still hate me?" She slowly closed her book, looking at him with an expression that mixed weariness and curiosity. "I don't know, Charles, but I do know that I don't trust you completely, and that's something that takes time." Charles nodded, accepting her words as a necessary blow. "I understand," he said, with a firmness Eloise didn't expect. "And I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust, not because of the wager or pride, but because I've realized that your opinion matters to me more than anything else." Eloise felt her heart race but maintained her composed expression. "Then show me, Charles. Show me that your actions can speak louder than your words." Charles's gestures continued to gain weight. He initiated reforms in his businesses, adopting fairer practices and creating support programs for families affected by his past decisions. Eloise watched these changes carefully. Although still reluctant, she couldn't ignore that she was beginning to see a different side of Charles, a man who acknowledged his flaws and worked to correct them. One afternoon, while walking together in the gardens, Charles surprised her with an unexpected question. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me, Eloise?" She stopped, looking at the flowers swaying gently in the wind. She remained silent for a few moments before answering. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, Charles. It's something you earn. But maybe you're on the right path." Charles smiled, but this time there was no trace of arrogance in his expression, only gratitude. Although neither of them knew for certain, that moment marked an important change between them. Eloise was still cautious, protecting herself with an armor built over years of distrust. But at the same time, a small part of her began to believe that perhaps Charles could be more than the man she thought she knew. Charles, on the other hand, began to realize that what he was striving for wasn't just forgiveness or trust. It was something much deeper, something he had never sought before. The love of a woman who couldn't be bought, convinced, or manipulated, but who was absolutely essential. With winter covering London in a cold gray, the long nights and biting winds couldn't entirely penetrate Elliott Mansion. Inside, something was beginning to change. Charles and Eloise had moved from a coexistence marked by mistrust to a delicate balance, permeated by small gestures of complicity. Still, the past hovered over them like a stubborn shadow that refused to fade. Charles, on his journey to right the wrongs of the past, spent nights revisiting old contracts and documents. When he found the contract that had sealed Eloise's father's fate, his blood ran cold. It was more than a piece of paper. It was the symbol of everything he had done, without considering human consequences. The following morning, he sought Eloise. Holding the document, his hands reflected his unease. "I needed to show you this," he said, his voice heavy with gravity. "I don't want to hide anything anymore." Eloise took the contract, her fingers slightly trembling as she read the words that had destroyed her family. For long moments, silence reigned between them. Finally, she raised her eyes, her voice laden with emotion. "Did you know, Charles? When you signed this, did you know what you were doing?" He shook his head, guilt evident in his gaze. Number I was young, ambitious, and blind to the consequences. I didn't know, but that's no excuse. I was irresponsible. Eloise closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the torrent of emotions overwhelming her. "Charles," she finally said, "you're trying to fix your mistakes now, but the past doesn't disappear so easily. You destroyed the man I loved most in this world." Her words cut Charles deeply, but he remained firm. "I know, Eloise, and I know I can't undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to be better, not just for you, but for everyone I've wronged." Eloise watched him closely. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine remorse. He was no longer the arrogant and calculating man she had known. He was someone beginning to face his flaws, and that confused and moved her. In the days that followed, Eloise began to notice a change in Charles that went beyond words. He didn't just promise to be better, he was acting on it. One morning, she found him in the kitchen, helping the staff organize donations for needy families. The sight of Charles, the ever-impeccable Duke of Silvermere, carrying sacks of flour, was enough to elicit a soft laugh from her. "This is new," she commented, crossing her arms as she observed him. "Lord Elliot, the philanthropist." Charles looked at her with a modest smile. "I think you're seeing my most impressive side, Eloise." The moment was light, almost mundane, but for both of them, it was significant. It was in these small gestures that Eloise began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was room for something more between them. Despite the progress, Eloise still found herself confronted by her own fears. The solitary nights in her room became moments of introspection. Watching the snow fall outside, she wondered if she was ready to forgive Charles, not for what he had done in the past, but for the man he was becoming now. And what was that new feeling beginning to stir within her? Could it be love, or something close to it? The uncertainty was as frightening as the past she still carried. The following morning, Eloise found Charles in the garden. He was leaning against a tree, his eyes fixed on the gray sky. When she called out to him, he turned, the intensity of his gaze causing her to hesitate. "Charles," she began, her voice firm but hesitant, "I want you to know that it's still difficult for me, but I see what you're doing, and it means something." He approached her slowly, with the care of someone treading on delicate ground. "I never thought someone like you could give me a second chance, Eloise, and that means more to me than anything I've ever had." She gave a faint smile, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. "I never thought you could surprise me either, but here we are." As the weeks passed, the relationship between Charles and Eloise began to strengthen. The scars of the past were still there, but gradually they became less painful. Both knew the path ahead would be long and full of challenges, but there was something new between them, a shared hope. That harsh winter, as the snow blanketed the world in purity, Charles and Eloise found something precious: It wasn't the absence of hurt or complete redemption, but the promise of a new beginning, something that, if carefully nurtured, could bloom when spring finally arrived. And so, with two hearts learning to beat in unison, they discovered that the weight of truth, when shared, becomes lighter. Epilogue. A new beginning. Spring arrived in London with the promise of renewal, bringing soft warmth and vibrant colors that seemed to reflect the transformation within Elliot Mansion. The estate, once marked by an oppressive coldness, now exuded life. In the garden, Eloise worked patiently, tending to the blossoming flowers, her careful hands guiding nature with delicacy. Behind her, Charles's familiar footsteps crunched over the gravel. When she turned, she found him with a calm smile, devoid of the arrogance that had once defined him. "Good morning," he said, his voice tranquil. "Good morning, Charles," she replied, a slight curve on her lips. "I didn't expect to see you so early." He laughed softly. "Neither did I. But lately I've realized that the simplest moments are the most meaningful, and it seems you're always at the center of them." Eloise returned her attention to the flowers, but her hands hesitated. Charles's tone was different, free of games or ulterior motives. She knew they had both come a long way, but it was still hard to believe in the growing ease between them. "Eloise," Charles said, kneeling beside her. His expression was grave, but his eyes shone with an emotion he rarely expressed. "I need to say something that may take you time to believe, but it's the truth." He met her gaze, his voice firm, yet tinged with vulnerability. "I love you. Not because I want to redeem myself or win something, but because you are the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you." Eloise felt the weight of his words like a wave. For a moment, she remained silent, studying Charles's face for any hint of falsehood. But all she found was sincerity. "Charles," she began, her voice low and controlled, "I never thought I'd hear this from you, much less believe it." She took a deep breath, lifting her gaze to the clear sky above before continuing. "But I believe you, and maybe, against all odds, I feel the same." The smile that spread across Charles's face was unlike any other Eloise had seen. It wasn't triumphant, but filled with relief and genuine happiness. He stood, extending his hand to her, and together they walked through the garden. The months that followed were marked by rebuilding. Charles continued his work of restructuring his companies, transforming them into forces for positive impact. Eloise, by his side, used her sensitivity and pragmatism to assist in decision-making. She wasn't just a wife. She was a partner, an essential balance to Charles's plans. A defining moment came when Charles gathered the mansion's staff to thank them, something he had never done before. He looked them in the eyes, acknowledging their hard work and making it clear that everyone was important. Watching from afar, Eloise felt a quiet pride. The man before her was living proof that change was possible. One afternoon, as they rested on the veranda, Charles took Eloise's hand and broke the silence. "Do you think we've made it?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Eloise tilted her head, studying him with a subtle smile. "Made it where, Charles?" "Overcome the past. Built something real." She gently squeezed his hand, her eyes fixed on his. "I think we're on the right path, and for now, that's enough." Charles nodded, taking in her words. They weren't a happy ending, but a promising beginning. It was all he needed. As the sun set on the horizon, casting golden tones over the garden, Charles and Eloise stood side by side. Both knew there was still work to be done, within themselves, in their relationship, and in the world around them. But for the first time, they felt they were no longer alone. The love that had grown between them, against all odds, was now the foundation for something rare and precious, a second chance. And so, with the scars of the past now transformed into lessons, Charles and Eloise faced the future together, one step at a time, guided by the strength of respect, trust, and a love that bloomed like spring flowers.